Hello, you're watching Scotland at 7. It's Thursday, the 5th of May, and I'm Hugh Stewart in our Glasgow studio. Okay, I'm going to do a short programme tonight. We don't have a guest, and as usual, I'm afraid we're going to have to begin with the Ukraine update. It's page 70, day 71 of Putin's illegal attack on Ukraine. So the latest, another 344 people have been rescued from the besieged city of Mariupol in a second evacuation operation. Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed this in his latest national address. However, the Ukrainian president said that civilians would need to be dug out of bunkers by hand under the Azov-style steelworks, as heavy equipment cannot be used. Russia said it will implement a ceasefire for 3 days from today to allow more civilian evacuations from the Azov-style steelworks in Mariupol. However, Ukraine has claimed Russia resumed its offensive on Mariupol in order to take control of the plant, saying that heavy fighting continues. Russia said its artillery struck multiple Ukrainian positions and strongholds overnight, killing 600 fighters. The Russian Defense Ministry also said its missiles destroyed aviation equipment at the Kanatovo airfield in Ukraine's central Kirovohrad region and a large ammunition depot in the southern city of Mykolaiv. Ukraine's military says it has regained control over several settlements, including Mykolaiv and Kherson in the country's south. The Russian Belgorod villages of Zuralavivka and Nekolivka have been shelled by Ukraine with no casualties, according to the region's governor, Vlasichav Gladkov. The United States has provided intelligence which has helped the Ukrainian forces kill many of the Russian generals who have died in the Ukraine war, the New York Times has reported, citing senior US officials. Washington has reportedly provided details on Russia's expected troop movements and the location and other details about its mobile military headquarters. Reports claim almost 200,000 children from the self-proclaimed breakaway republics in Ukraine, those are Donetsk and Luhansk, have been so far taken to Russia since this latest conflict began on the 24th of February. Ukrainian authorities have accused Russia of carrying out forced deportations from the east of the country. Russia said its forces practiced simulated nuclear missile strikes on Wednesday in the western enclave of Kaliningrad, which is between Poland and Lithuania. Germany is preparing to supply Ukraine with 7 Panzerhaubitze 2000 armoured howitzers, granting explicit wishes by Kyiv for material support in the shape of self-propelled weapons systems which can hit targets at a distance of 40 kilometres, that's about 25 miles. The UK is providing £45 million in funding to help the most vulnerable in Ukraine, and at its borders, the UK government has said the money will go to UN agencies and charities delivering aid and supporting survivors of sexual violence. President Joe Biden said he would speak to the other G7 leaders this week about potential additional sanctions against Russia, and his Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the US was in constant discussions with its partners about this. Volodymyr Zelensky said he believed Ukraine would again see peace despite Russia's war, but warned that what happens in Ukraine will have important consequences for the rest of Europe. Addressing the people of Denmark on their 77th anniversary of their liberation from Nazi occupation, he said, "I do believe our day of liberation is coming close." Our next story is about the Ukrainian children trying to get into the UK on the refugee scheme. Under 18s travelling alone are not permitted to be hosted under the Homes for Ukraine programme, leaving them no route to the UK. UK families who had been carefully vetted and subject to enhanced DBS checks are frustrated that they cannot help teenagers with whom they had been matched. Many are already alone and vulnerable to trafficking and abuse. The UK government claims the policy is designed to safeguard children, but by offering no alternative, charities say it could leave young people in greater danger in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe. One 17-year-old has spent the last 3 weeks listening to fighter planes fly over his village in western Ukraine and hoping that his UK visa will arrive soon. Nazari applied to join a family in Hampshire under Homes for Ukraine scheme on the 11th of April and thought it would be straightforward. But with no decision from the Home Office, it appears that Nazari may be the latest casualty of a government policy that denies visas to unaccompanied children. For Nazari, travelling with his parents is not an option. His mother has to care for elderly relatives in their village near Ternopil, and his family is a much-needed doctor. His potential host, Samantha Reid, who's a 54-year-old from Church Crookham in Hampshire, works as a teaching assistant and lives with her husband, Tim, and their 17-year-old son, Theo. She said she rang the Home Office helpline at the start of April to see if she could host a 17-year-old and was told it was fine if there was written parental permission. After DBS checks and vetting by social services, they were expecting the visa any day. Rubina Qureshi, the chief executive of the refugee hosting charity Positive Action in Housing, said, "The thing that is most shocking about this is that the most vulnerable of refugees, unaccompanied children, are being denied access to the UK. Qureshi wants established charities like hers, with experience of placing refugees with families, to be allowed to bring teenagers to Britain." She said, "We need the government to act urgently for the sake of 18 unaccompanied minors whom we are supporting at present, and who are at risk of trafficking or being forced to live in or return to a war zone. They are frankly terrified," she said. A government spokesperson said, "Due to concerns, unaccompanied minors are only eligible under Homes for Ukraine scheme if they are reuniting with a parent or a legal guardian in the UK." Okay, now turning to the economy. The UK economy is facing recession. Inflation is up, interest rates are up, and the pound is down. Concerned that inflation may rise to 10%, the Bank of England today raised interest rates to 1%, accepting the risk that the UK is set for an economic recession in 2023. The pound fell against the dollar to $1.24. That's the lowest it's been since 2020. The Bank of England expects poor economic growth for the next few years, with the UK economy expected to shrink by 0.25%, a quarter of a percent, in 2023, while unemployment could rise to 5.5%. Slow growth will be the consequence of lower spending by consumers who continue to face big increases in food and energy bills, while many people's incomes stagnate. Gas and electricity bills, which have already seen a massive increase, will rise again in October, possibly by 40%. The Bank of England, like the Eurobank in Frankfurt, has an inflation target of 2%. As the UK inflation rate may reach 10% by this year, the bank is expected to announce further rate increases, possibly up to 2.5% by next year, as it attempts to tackle the highest inflation figures we've seen since 1982. The increase in interest rates will put further pressure on households who pay a mortgage or who have other loans outstanding, while at the same time providing benefits to people who enjoy savings. The bank hopes, however, that this rate increase will see inflation falling back to the target rate within 2 years. In the US also, the Federal Reserve Bank has raised interest rates as inflation in America reached its highest level for 48 years. Some good news, however. Shell is doing swell. The Shell Oil Company has reported a record quarterly profit of $9.1 billion in dollars, that's about £7.3 billion in pounds, for the first 3 months of this year, piling more pressure on the UK government to implement a windfall tax to fund measures which could tackle those soaring household energy bills. The first quarter profit was boosted by the sharp rise in oil and gas prices, and compared with the $6.3 billion of profits in the final 3 months of 2021, and the $3.2 billion during the first quarter of last year. Remember, this year it's $9 billion. These figures are in dollars. Okay, so it was above analysts' expectations, who were looking at adjusted quarterly earnings of $8.7 billion in dollars, but it's even higher than that. Campaigners have called for a one-off levy on companies benefiting from the soaring oil and gas prices to fund the government's initiatives to reduce the burden of rising bills. Shell's update comes after the BP, British Petroleum, reported its highest quarterly profit in more than a decade. On Tuesday this week, its profits more than doubled to $6.2 billion, again sparking a clamour for a windfall tax. The government has so far resisted calls for such a levy. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has said that such a move would discourage oil and gas producers from making investments into domestic energy. However, BP's chief executive, Bernard Looney, has said that none of the 18 billion UK investments which the company is planning would be dropped if a windfall tax were imposed. Shell plans to invest between 20 billion and 25 billion on the UK energy investments over the next decade, predominantly in low-carbon projects. Chief Executive Ben van Beurden said that while the windfall tax may not force it to shelf any specific projects, large-scale investments do, however, require what he called a stable and predictable financial outlook. Shell returned $5.4 billion to shareholders, that's in dollars, in the quarter, and plans to spend $4.5 billion buying its own shares in the coming months. It announced plans to raise its dividend by about 4% to 0.25, that's 25 cents in the dollar, a share for the first quarter of the year. Van Beurden rejected suggestions that the oil and gas industry was profiting from the conflict in Ukraine. Next story. Sunak can't raise benefits, computer says no. As we've seen, inflation may reach 10% and is right now at 7%. In his spring statement earlier this year, UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak raised benefits by 3.1%. That was based on the inflation figures from last September, as measured by the Consumer Price Index. Since then, the Chancellor has faced calls to bring that increase up to 7%, but has been told by officials that the ancient IT system in use at the UK Treasury will only allow him to change benefits once a year. Old so-called legacy benefits, such as job seekers allowance, are due to be replaced by universal credit, but at the moment they are still administered by an IT system which is 40 years old and which can only accept changes in the autumn. Universal credit updates, however, can be done in a few weeks. A spokesperson for the DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions, UK-wide, said, Parliament voted to end the complex web of 6 legacy benefits in 2012. And as this work approaches its conclusion in 2024, we are fully transitioning to a modern benefit suited to the 21st century. We recognise the pressures people are facing with the cost of living, which is why we are providing support of up to £22 billion across the next financial year, including our Household Support Fund. Chancellor Sunak did raise universal credit by £20 a week during the COVID crisis, but refused calls continued that uplift in his March statement. Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, told us last week that the benefits which the Scottish Government is responsible for have been raised by 6%. Media story now. Channel 4 asset sale to avoid privatisation. Channel 4 has said it could sell its £100 million London headquarters and almost double the number of staff working outside the capital under plans to become what they call more northern-based, and it hopes to offer an attractive alternative to the government's privatisation push. Describing itself in the proposals as the levelling up broadcaster, Channel 4 said intends to increase spending on TV shows commissioned outside London by hundreds of millions of pounds annually by 2030, in a move it estimated would create at least 3,000 jobs. Channel 4, which is state-owned but commercially funded, said that the changes would mean the majority of its 800 staff would be based in locations including its new national headquarters, which is Leeds, and in hubs such as Glasgow, Bristol, Manchester and Birmingham, with a number of staff working outside London nearly doubling to 600 by year 2025. Channel 4 continued, alongside this, we would streamline our presence in London by creating a new London base that reflects our new ways of working. The broadcaster said this in its plan, which is called For the Next Episode. The plan has been rejected by the UK government. Channel 4 continued, as we embrace hybrid working and reorient our focus away from London to the nations and regions, a reorientation intrinsic to our existence in public ownership, Channel 4 may require a different scale London base. The government has its eyes on a £100 million windfall of a potential sale of Channel 4's headquarters in Victoria, central London, and they looked at that the last time it attempted to privatise this broadcaster, but ultimately backed down. Channel 4's plan also includes the creation of a joint venture with an external investor as a majority shareholder to spend £200 annually on new content and ultimately boost its total programming budget from £700 million a year to £1 billion a year by 2030. Other plans include launching its all 4 streaming service globally, targeting younger demographics, which it believes could make a further £100 million annually. Last week, the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, that's the DCMS UK-wide, started the formal process to privatise Channel 4 in a wide-ranging white paper shaking up the British media industry, despite widespread opposition across the sector and from Labour and Conservative MPs. Arguing it needs to be in private hands, this is the UK government, arguing that Channel 4 needs to be in private hands to be able to compete financially with global streaming giants such as Netflix. The government's consultation received 56,000 responses, 96% of which were against privatisation. And our next story takes us to Israel and Palestine. The Israeli court has paved the way for the eviction of 1,000 Palestinians from the West Bank area. After a 2-decade legal battle, Israel's High Court has ruled that about 1,000 Palestinians can be evicted from an area of the West Bank, and this is for land repurposed for the Israeli military, in one of the biggest single expulsion decisions since the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories began in 1967. About 3,000 hectares of the Masafar Yatta, a rural area in the South Hebron Hills, under full Israeli control and home to several small Palestinian villages, was designated as a firing zone by the Israeli state in the 1980s to be used for military exercise, in which the presence of civilians is prohibited. According to the Geneva Conventions pertaining to humanitarian treatment in a war, it's illegal to expropriate occupied land for purposes that do not benefit the people living there, or to forcibly transfer the local population. Israel has argued, however, that Masafar Yatta villagers living in the firing zone 918, as they call it, farming and raising animals there, were not permanent residents of the area when the firing zone was declared, and therefore have no rights to the land. The High Court decision, published overnight on Wednesday, ahead of Israel's Independence Day, which is today, Thursday, a public holiday, accepted the state's argument that the community could not prove they were residents before the 1980s, despite expert testimony and literature presented in court that showed that the area had been inhabited for decades. The judges also rejected the claim that the prohibition of forcible transfer set forth in international law is customary and binding, calling it instead, they said it is not customary and binding, calling it instead a treaty norm that's not enforceable in a domestic court, according to the Israeli international human rights lawyer Michael Svard. Since the judge's decision was unanimous, it's not clear whether any further Israeli legal channels are available for the residents of the 8 Masafar Yatta villages to appeal. While the ruling does not order evictions, should it choose to do so, Israel could now forcibly expel the Palestinians at any time. The court decision is a racist decision taken by a settler judge, David Mins, who lives in an illegal settlement in the West Bank, said Nidal Yuns, the head of the Masafar Yatta Village Council. We have been fighting with Israel in the courts for the last 22 years, and it took this judge 5 minutes to destroy the lives of 12 villages and the people who are dependent on the land. 18% of the occupied West Bank has been declared firing zones for Israeli military training since the 1970s. According to the minutes of a 1981 ministerial meeting, the then Agriculture Minister Ariel Sharon who later became Prime Minister, proposed creating Firing Zone 918 with the explicit intention of forcing local Palestinians from their homes. Residents of Massif Yatta, who have also been subject to intensifying attacks from nearby illegal Israeli settler communities in recent years. In 1999, 700 residents of Firing Zone 918 were evicted after an appeal by the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, the ACRI. The Supreme Court issued an injunction allowing the residents to return until the final decision was made by the High Court. The injunction had remained, and the easy status quo continued until Wednesday's ruling. Breaking the silence, an Israeli NGO said in a statement, the High Court has just green-lighted the largest population transfer in the history of reoccupation since the early 1970s. And now to Syria. A charity says that UK aid cuts have forced 40,000 Syrian children out of school. More than 40,000 Syrian children are out of school as a direct result of UK government foreign aid cuts, and more schools could soon close, a leading charity has said. UK funding for 133 schools run by Syrian Relief ended on the 30th of April as the government cuts its total foreign aid spending from its commitment of 0.7% of the economy to 0.5%. That's 0.5% of GDP. If funds are not found to plug the gaps left by the UK government and other donors, a generation of children in northern Syria will be out of school, and this will lead to a close to immediate rise in child labour, child marriage, early pregnancies, child conscription to military and armed groups, child exploitation and child trafficking, said Jessica Adams, the head of communications for Syria Relief and its parent charity Action for Humanity. This was a political choice that we and the children, parents and teachers of Syria hoped desperately will be reversed. The details of the UK's rushed £4.2 billion spending cuts in 2021 were revealed in March, and it was Syria that received the harshest cuts, despite millions of people still living in refugee and displacement camps there more than 10 years after the conflicts began. Spending on Syria was slashed by 69%, including cuts to programmes on education, health, maternal health and Palestinian refugees. Syria Relief has said it has been the largest non-government provider of schools in Syria, with 306 schools, but with other donors also reducing spending or redirecting aid to Ukraine. It currently supports 3,600 children in 24 remaining schools which face closure by August, leaving a total of 100,000 children left without an education since 2021. The charity said the closures would defeat the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office's stated goal of helping more girls into school and push more girls into early marriages. The UN estimates that 14.6 million Syrians are in need of humanitarian aid. The EU is hosting a conference next week aimed at encouraging donations and pushing for a resolution to the conflict. Okay, now let's look at the news from United States. President Joe Biden has warned of new attacks on civil rights as the US Supreme Court prepares to strike down the right to abortion, telling reporters at the White House the LGBTQ plus children could be the next targets of the Trump-dominated Republican Party. He called the MAGA crowd as the most extreme political organization in recent American history. What happens, the president asked, if a state challenges a law saying that children who are LGBTQ can't be in classrooms with other children? Is that legit under the way the decision is written? Biden's remarks at the end of a brief session on deficit reduction referred to a leaked draft of the ruling by Justice Samuel Alito, one of the 6 conservatives on the Supreme Court. Judge Alito was writing on a Mississippi case which aims to overturn Roe v. Wade, which is a 1973 ruling guaranteeing the right to abortion, and also Casey v. the Planned Parenthood from 1992, which supported that ruling. The Mississippi case is expected to be resolved in June. The leak of the draft ruling to Politico, which also reported that four other conservatives on the 9-justice court supported it, caused a storm of controversy and anger. In a statement and remarks on Tuesday, President Biden condemned Judge Alito's reasoning and intentions and called for legislation to codify Roe Wade into law. But the president has faced criticism within his own party for seeming reluctant to contemplate the forms such legislation would require, namely abolishing the Senate filibuster, the rule which requires 60 votes for most bills to pass. A lifelong Catholic who nonetheless supports a woman's right to choose, President Biden has been eclipsed as a strong voice against the attack on abortion rights by high-profile Democrat women, including Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, who spoke angrily outside the court on Tuesday, and also by the Vice President Kamala Harris. The Vice President said, "Those Republican leaders who are trying to weaponize the use of law against women, we say, how dare they? How dare they tell a woman what she can and cannot do with her own body? How dare they? How dare they try to stop her from determining her own future? How dare they try to deny women their rights and freedoms?" Ms. Harris said, "Some Republican leaders want to take us back to a time before Roe v. Wade." The Vice President also said, "Let us fight for our country and for the principles upon which it was founded, and let us fight with everything we've got." Okay, now, Japanese contemporary design at the National Museum of Scotland. We learned today that a new artwork by groundbreaking Japanese artist Hitomi Hosono will be unveiled in a display at the National Museum of Scotland. Japanese contemporary design will run from the 6th of May, that's tomorrow, 2022, until the 5th of March next year, 23, and will showcase developments in art, craft and design in Japan over the next 50 years. Over the past 50 years, that would be more logical. Hisono's spectacular, a large pine tree pool has recently been acquired for the National Collection and will be shown for the first time. From striking statement jewellery to glass and porcelain sculptures, this free display will explore the rich and varied practice of Japanese contemporary designers over 5 decades. Cultural events associated with the 1964 Tokyo Olympics prompted Japanese makers to take notice of international design. The artists represented in the display reflect the developments of the following 50 years, combining traditional artisanship and themes with new materials, inspiration and techniques. A more diverse range of makers has also emerged in Japan in recent years. The ceramicist Hitomi Hosono is one of the highly skilled female artists breaking into historically male-dominated disciplines. This follows a move away from the traditional apprenticeship-based system and a long-established custom of the eldest son taking over from his father. Japanese contemporary design will include an equal number of works by female and male makers, shining a light on some remarkable artisans who had previously been overlooked. Dr. Louise Boyd, curator of the Japanese and Ainu collections at the National Museums of Scotland, said, "This display will highlight the extraordinary skill and diversity of contemporary Japanese makers. The objects exhibited represent recent developments in the artwork, both in Japan and internationally. I am particularly delighted to include Hitomi Hosono's work, a large pine tree pool, for a display to the public to enjoy for the very first time. Further highlights include Mori's intricate new pinecone silver organism. Nature is seen as a fundamental element of a traditional Japanese culture. Mori incorporates new methods and forms influenced by studying and working in the UK. Striking examples of contemporary jewellery designs will also be showcased, adapting metalworking and engraving techniques traditionally used in the making of the Japanese sword. Jewellery Suo Emiko has created a wonderful graphic pieces to adorn the body." Okay, so that's at the National Museums of Scotland. Now that's it tonight. Of course, people are very busy with the elections, and so don't forget to vote. If you haven't voted yet, I have not, by the way, so I'm going to go straight down to do that once I've finished up here in the studio, so I'll need to make my mind up quick. So as we go off the air. The polling stations close in 2.5 hours. Broadcasting Scotland will be covering the vote tomorrow. Most council election results will be counted by lunchtime, or we think middle of the afternoon. Most councils are going to start counting around between 8 and 9:30 tomorrow, we hear. So we should have some results by lunchtime, and we will be on the air tomorrow afternoon to give you the latest. So if you've not voted yet, you've still got that time of speaking, you've still got a couple of hours. So that's it for tonight. More news later and through the weekend and next week, we hope. Now, can I just remind you of that story earlier on about the importance of broadcasting? Clearly, the UK government feels it's very important to privatise a UK broadcaster, and clearly with those responses, broadcasting is important. Now, we at Broadcasting Scotland feel that no matter how the UK government stitches up broadcasting, we don't feel that Scotland has adequate broadcasting. Scotland needs an independent broadcaster, and we would like to be that broadcaster. We can only manage one show a week, one show a night at the moment, and a couple of shows a week. Our funding entirely comes from our viewers, and I know many of you are funding us, so thank you for doing that. But the simple fact is, if you want more programmes from Broadcasting Scotland, made here, made in Scotland, from our point of view, then it needs to be paid for. So if you haven't done so, please have a look at our website, broadcastingscotland.scot, and it really would be great if you click on the donate button and set up a wee standing order. Whatever you can manage once a month helps us to keep the lights on here, pay our own electricity bills, and as I said before, every pound we get in goes into programme making. We're volunteers, and the money just keeps our shows going out. So that's it for Scotland at 7 tonight. I'm Hugh Stewart. Thank you for watching. I'm away to vote now, and we'll see you later. Bye.